Imagine a night so ancient that no human eye had ever seen a star and thought to name it. The air is thick and warm. A dense forest stretches across what will one day become the continent of Africa, though the word Africa does not yet exist because words do not yet exist. The trees are enormous. The undergrowth is alive with sound. And somewhere in the dim, filtered light beneath the canopy, something is moving. It is small. It walks sometimes on 4 limbs, sometimes on 2. Its face is neither quite ape nor quite human. Its brain holds no language, no memory of yesterday, no dream of tomorrow. It does not know what it is. But it is the beginning of us. What you are about to hear is the longest story ever told, not by any human but about humans. It spans 7 million years. It crosses ice ages and volcanic winters, dense jungles and open savannas, ocean crossings made on foot. It is a story of survival and extinction, of slow transformation and sudden leaps, of species that rose, walked the earth for hundreds of thousands of years, and then vanished, leaving only bones and occasional tools and sometimes nothing at all. We call it human evolution. But that phrase is almost too simple for what it really is. It is not a straight line. It is not a ladder with one rung leading neatly to the next. It is more like a river system, branching, merging, flooding, drying up, finding new channels. And at the end of that river system, sitting on this planet tonight, is you. Over the course of this journey, we will move through 7 great stages. We will begin 7 million years ago with a small creature whose skull was found in the desert sands of Chad, a creature so ancient that scientists still debate whether it belongs to the human family at all. From there, we will follow the southern ape walkers of Africa, creatures that stood upright on the open savanna long before their brains had grown large enough to understand what standing upright would one day make possible. We will meet the first toolmakers, the first travelers, the first hunters, and the first artists. We will spend time with our closest extinct relatives, the Neanderthals, and learn that they were far more like us than we were ever taught to believe. And finally, we will arrive at our own species, Homo sapiens, the storyteller, the one that survived. This is not a story with a simple hero. Every species in this story was the hero of its own age. Every one of them was perfectly adapted to the world they lived in. And every one of them in some way made us possible. So settle in. Let the darkness of the room around you become the darkness of deep time. Let your breathing slow. And let the story begin, 7 million years ago in a world so different from our own that it barely seems real, on the edge of a shrinking forest, where something small and curious first looked out at an open horizon. The year is 2001. A team of paleontologists led by French scientist Michel Brunet is working in the Jurub Desert of northern Chad, a remote, brutally hot region in Central Africa, far from the East African fossil sites that most researchers focus on. They are not expecting to find anything extraordinary. The desert floor here is ancient lakebed, cracked and pale, scattered with fragments of bone baked hard by millions of years of sun. Then one of Brunet's team members, a Chadian student named Ahunta Jimdumulbe, picks up something that stops everyone cold. It is a skull. Small, roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, crushed slightly by the weight of ages pressing down on it. But the moment the team gets a closer look, something feels different. The brow ridge, the thick shelf of bone above the eye sockets, is enormous, more like a gorilla's than a chimp's. The teeth are small and positioned in a way that doesn't quite match any known ape. And the base of the skull, the region called the foramen magnum where the spine connects to the brain, is positioned further forward than in any ape ever found. That detail, the angle of the foramen magnum, matters enormously. In apes, the spine connects to the skull from behind because they walk on all fours with their head jutting forward. In upright walkers, the spine connects from below because the head sits balanced on top of a vertical column. The position of this skull's foramen magnum suggests, very tentatively, that this creature may have walked upright. And if it did, it changes everything. Michel Brunet's team names the creature Sahelanthropus tchadensis, Sahelanthropus for the Sahel region, tchadensis for Chad. They give it a nickname drawn from the local Goran language, Tumai. It means hope of life, the name given to children born just before the dry season, when survival is uncertain. Tumai is between 6 and 7 million years old. That places it right at the moment in the fossil record when the human lineage is believed to have split from the lineage that would eventually produce modern chimpanzees. For context, if you compress the last 7 million years into a single calendar year, Tumai would appear on January 1st. You and I are standing at midnight on December 31st. The world Tumai lived in was in the middle of a slow, massive transformation. Africa's climate was shifting. The vast tropical forests that had covered much of the continent were beginning to fragment, shrinking and breaking apart as the climate cooled and dried. In their place, grasslands were spreading, open, dangerous, unforgiving landscapes with no canopy to hide under and no trees to retreat to when predators came. For the creatures living through this change, it was not an opportunity. It was a crisis. And yet, in crisis, evolution accelerates. Toma's skull, small as it is, carries hints of what that acceleration would eventually produce. The brain inside was not large, roughly 360 cubic centimeters, similar to a modern chimpanzee. There was no language, no planning, no art, no fire. The creature that owned this skull probably ate fruit and leaves, slept in trees, and moved carefully through a landscape full of things that wanted to eat it. In almost every way it was an ape. But almost every way is not every way. The debate over Toma has never fully been resolved. Some scientists argue that the forward position foramen magnum is enough to place it at the base of the human family tree. Others argue that a skull alone, with no limb bones, no pelvis, no foot, cannot confirm upright walking, and that Toma may simply be an unusual ape that happened to share some features with later hominins. A femur fragment found near the skull site has been analyzed by different researchers with different conclusions, and the argument continues in scientific journals to this day. What is not in dispute is that Toma represents something real and something important. A creature living at the very edge of the divide between ape and human, in a time and place where that divide was just beginning to open. The forests were shrinking. The grasslands were calling. And in the shadows of that ancient African landscape, something was changing, slowly, invisibly, without any awareness of what it was becoming. A whisper in deep time. The first shadow of what we would one day be.
3.5 million years ago, in what is now the Afar region of northern Ethiopia, a small female walks through a woodland near a lake. She is just over a meter tall. She walks upright, her arms slightly longer than ours, her brain small, her face projecting forward in a way that is still more ape than human. She does not know her name. She will not have one for another 3.5 million years. We will call her Lucy. In November of 1974, paleoanthropologist Donald Johansen and his graduate student Tom Gray are surveying a gully in Hadar, Ethiopia, when Johansen spots a fragment of arm bone sticking out of a slope. He recognizes immediately that it is hominin. The team spends the next 3 weeks carefully excavating the site, and when they are done, they have recovered 40% of a complete skeleton, the most complete ancient hominin ever found at that time. That night, at camp, they play the Beatles' song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds on repeat. The fossil gets its name. Lucy belongs to a species called Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus meaning southern ape, afarensis for the Afar region. She is 3.2 million years old. But she is not alone in the fossil record. The Australopithecus genus, in its various forms, spans roughly 2 million years, from about 4 million to just under 2 million years ago, and includes multiple species spread across Africa. There is Australopithecus africanus, found in South Africa. There is Australopithecus boisé, nicknamed Nutcracker Man for its enormous jaw and crushing molars, adapted for processing tough, hard foods. There is Australopithecus sediba, discovered in South Africa in 2008, which shows a surprising mix of ancient and modern features that still puzzles researchers. But it is Afarensis, Lucy's species, that gives us some of the most vivid evidence of what early bipedal life actually looked like in practice. In 1976, at Litoli in Tanzania, a team led by Mary Leakey makes a discovery that removes all remaining doubt about when upright walking began. Preserved in a layer of volcanic ash 3.6 million years old, they find footprints. Not bone, not tools. Footprints. A trail of them, left by 2 or possibly 3 individuals walking side by side through freshly fallen volcanic ash that then hardened like cement. The prints show a heel strike, an arch, and a push-off from the big toe, a walking pattern that is unmistakably and fully bipedal. Whoever made these prints was not shuffling along awkwardly. They were walking, the same way you walk to your kitchen in the morning. And yet the brain inside the skull of the creature making those footprints was barely larger than a chimpanzee's, between 450 and 500 cubic centimeters. Intelligence, as we measure it, had not yet arrived. What had arrived was the body plan, the upright posture, the freed hands, the long legs built for covering ground across an open landscape. Why did bipedalism come before the brain? This is one of the most fascinating questions in paleoanthropology, and the answer is almost certainly ecological. The shrinking forests that had already begun to affect Tomaya's world had continued their retreat. The Australopithecus species lived at the boundary between what remained of the woodland and the expanding open savanna. In that environment, walking upright offered real advantages. It raised the eyes above the tall grass, it freed the hands to carry food, and, perhaps most importantly, it was energetically efficient for long-distance travel across open ground. The Australopithecus body was still built for two worlds: the long arms, the curved fingers, the shoulder structure. All of these suggest that these creatures still spent significant time in trees, likely sleeping there for safety at night. But on the ground, they walked. And in walking, they were doing something no ape before them had done with such commitment and consistency. Their diet reflected the changing landscape around them. The heavy molars and thick enamel of many Australopithecus species point to a diet heavy in hard foods, seeds, tubers, tough roots, the kinds of things that became abundant as forests gave way to grassland. They were not hunters. They were foragers, moving through a landscape full of predators far larger and faster than themselves, surviving on resourcefulness and group cohesion. Social life existed, though we can only infer its shape. Group living was almost certainly necessary for survival on the open savanna, where a lone individual would be easy prey. Whether there was anything we might recognize as communication beyond what modern apes are capable of, calls, gestures, alarm signals, is impossible to know for certain. What the fossil record tells us is that they endured. For 2 million years, the Australopithecus lineage walked the African landscape, diversifying into multiple forms, filling different ecological niches, adapting and surviving. And then, around 2.5 million years ago, something new appeared. Something that had never existed before on this planet. They walked like us but thought like apes, and they stood at the very edge of something new. The Olduvai Gorge cuts through the Serengeti Plain of Tanzania like a wound in the earth, a steep ravine carved by an ancient river, its walls exposing layer after layer of geological time. Standing at the rim and looking down, you are looking at a record of nearly 2 million years of East African history, written in stone and bone and ash. It is one of the most important fossil sites in the world. It is here, in the early 1960s, that Lewis and Mary Leakey make the discovery that introduces the world to the third great chapter of human evolution. They find skull fragments, a lower jaw, and, crucially, hand bones. The hand bones are remarkable. They show a precision grip, the ability to hold an object between thumb and fingers in the same way a modern human holds a pen. And scattered nearby, unmistakably, are stone tools. The Leakeys name the new species Homo habilis, handy man. The inclusion of this creature in the genus Homo, our own genus, was controversial from the start, and the debate has never fully quieted. Homo habilis had a brain of between 600 and 700 cubic centimeters, larger than any Australopithecus, but still less than half the size of a modern human brain. Its body was still small, still somewhat ape-proportioned, with long arms that suggest a continued relationship with trees. Some researchers argue that it is better classified as a late Australopithecus than an early Homo. The boundary between the two genera, it turns out, is not a clean line but a blur. What is not debated is the significance of the tools. The stone tools associated with Homo habilis belong to what archaeologists call the Oldowan industry, the oldest recognized stone tool technology on Earth, dating to approximately 2.6 million years ago. These are not elaborate tools. They are, to the untrained eye, not obviously tools at all, lumps of rock with flakes knocked off one edge to create a sharp surface. But creating them required something genuinely new, the ability to look at a rock and see what it could become. To hold it in one hand and strike it with another stone at precisely the right angle to detach a sharp flake. To understand, at some level, that modifying an object could make it more useful. That is not instinct. That is, in its most elementary form, cognition. The tools were used for processing food. Sharp flakes could cut through animal hide, exposing meat that a hominid jaw was not strong enough to access on its own. They could be used to crack open bones, accessing the marrow inside, a dense, calorie-rich food source that most other predators leave behind. Homo habilis was not yet a hunter. It was almost certainly a scavenger, moving through the landscape after lions and hyenas had made a kill, using its tools to extract nutrition from what was left. Not glamorous, but effective. The shift toward a more meat-rich diet had consequences that rippled far into the future. Meat and marrow are extraordinarily calorie-dense compared to the roots and tubers that had sustained Australopithecus. More calories meant more energy available for a metabolically expensive organ, the brain. It is not a coincidence that the emergence of stone tools, the dietary shift toward animal protein, and the expansion of brain size all happen in roughly the same geological moment. They are almost certainly connected, though the exact causal chain is still being worked out by researchers. Homo habilis did not live alone in time. For hundreds of thousands of years, it shared the African landscape with the last of the Australopithecus species, including the robust forms like Boisé, with their enormous grinding molars and powerful jaws, adapted for a completely different dietary strategy. Two different experiments, running simultaneously on the same continent. One line investing in powerful chewing apparatus, the other investing in tools and the brains to make them. We know which experiment won, but in the moment, it was not obvious. Homo habilis was a small, vulnerable creature in a landscape full of large and dangerous predators. It had tools, but it had no weapons. It had a slightly larger brain, but that brain was nothing close to what would come next. It was a transitional form in the truest sense, not quite what came before, not yet what was coming. The moment a hand picked up a stone with intention, everything changed. The direction of that change would take another 2 million years to fully reveal itself. But it had begun.
For nearly 1 million years, the story of human evolution had been entirely African. Every fossil, every tool, every footprint had been found on that one continent, as if Africa were holding the experiment close, unwilling to let it leave. And then, approximately 1.9 million years ago, something crossed a border that no hominin had ever crossed before. The species that made that crossing was Homo erectus. And it would go on to become the most successful, most widely traveled and longest-lived human species that has ever existed. To understand why Homo erectus was able to do what no one before it had done, you have to understand the body. For the first time in the hominin lineage, we see a creature that looks, in its basic proportions, genuinely human. The legs are long, built for endurance walking, for covering miles of open ground without exhausting. The arms are shorter relative to the body, no longer the arms of an animal that spends significant time in trees. The pelvis and spine are fully committed to upright posture. The nose projects forward from the face, an adaptation that warms and humidifies air before it reaches the lungs, useful in dry, open environments, and a feature that becomes more important the further from the warm African tropics a population wanders. The brain had grown significantly, to around 900 cubic centimeters, nearly double what Australopithecus had managed, and considerably larger than Homo habilis. This larger brain came with a cost. A bigger brain requires more calories, more oxygen, more time to develop. Homo erectus infants were born more helpless and took longer to mature than any previous hominin. This created something new in the social world: dependency. Mothers needed help. Groups needed to cooperate more consistently. The social fabric was tightening in ways that would, eventually, make everything else possible. The tools that Homo erectus made reflect this cognitive leap. While the Oldowan tools of Homo habilis were effective, they were also simple. Sharp flakes knocked off a core with minimal shaping. The Acheulean tools associated with Homo erectus are something else entirely. The hand axe, the signature tool of this era, is a teardrop-shaped stone implement worked on both faces, symmetrical, often beautiful in its way. Making one requires planning several steps ahead. You cannot simply strike a rock and use the result. You have to hold a mental image of the finished form and work toward it, removing material carefully, correcting mistakes, adjusting your approach. This is not just tool use. This is technology. And then there is fire. The evidence for controlled fire use by Homo erectus comes from multiple sites, but among the most compelling is Wonderwork Cave in the northern Cape of South Africa. There, researchers have found burned bone and plant ash in layers dating to approximately 1 million years ago, evidence that fire was being used and possibly maintained deep inside a cave where it could not have started naturally. Other sites in China and Israel push the evidence for fire use to similar or slightly later dates. The exact moment when Homo erectus first learned to control fire, as opposed to simply using naturally occurring fires, remains uncertain. but by 1 million years ago the evidence is difficult to dismiss. What fire gave Homo erectus is almost impossible to overstate. Cooking food, even partially cooking it, dramatically increases the calories available from meat and plant material. It breaks down tough fibers, kills parasites, and makes nutrients more bioavailable. Researchers like Richard Wrangham have argued that the invention of cooking may be directly responsible for the further expansion of the brain that we see in later hominins, because cooking, in effect, allows you to do some of your digestion externally, freeing up metabolic energy for other organs. Fire also provided warmth, extending the range of habitable environments into cooler latitudes. It provided light, extending the active hours of the day beyond sunset. And it provided a gathering point, a center for social life in a way that nothing before it had. Around 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus appears in the fossil record at Dmanisi, in the country of Georgia, the oldest known hominin fossils found outside of Africa. The Dmanisi individuals are fascinating for another reason. They show an extraordinary range of variation, including one individual who had lost all his teeth long before death and yet survived for years afterward, suggesting that others in his group were feeding him. This is the earliest clear evidence we have of one hominin caring for another who could not care for themselves. It is a small thing in the fossil record. It is an enormous thing in human history. From Georgia, populations of Homo erectus spread east. In Java, Indonesia, then connected to mainland Asia by lower sea levels, fossils known as Java man were discovered in the 1890s, among the first ancient human relatives ever found. In China, a population known as Peking man left fossils and tools at a site called Zhoukoudian, near modern Beijing, dating to between 750,000 and 200,000 years ago. Populations also reached Europe, though the European fossil record for this period is complex and sometimes attributed to related species. Homo erectus survived in various forms and places for nearly 2 million years. That is a span of time so vast it is almost impossible to process. Homo sapiens, our own species, has existed for roughly 300,000 years, and in that time we have transformed the planet beyond recognition. Homo erectus existed for 6 times as long, and while it changed and adapted over those millennia, it did not transform the world in the same way. It endured. Steadily, stubbornly, across ice ages and warm periods, across 2 continents and then 3, it endured. They walked out of Africa not as wanderers searching for something, but as travelers following the land wherever it led. And the land led them everywhere. If Homo erectus was the great traveler, then the species that came next was the great bridge, connecting 2 worlds, 2 lineages, 2 futures that would diverge from a single ancestor and never fully meet again. We call it Homo heidelbergensis. It is, in many ways, the most important species in human evolution that most people have never heard of. The first specimen was discovered not in Africa but in Germany. In 1907, a worker at a sand quarry near the town of Mauer, outside Heidelberg, found a jaw buried in the sediment. It was thick and heavy with no chin, but the teeth were small and human-like. It was clearly not Homo erectus and it was clearly not modern human. Scientists gave it the name Homo heidelbergensis, after the nearby city, and then spent most of the following century arguing about what it actually was. What it was, we now believe, was the common ancestor of 2 of the most significant species in the story of human evolution, the Neanderthals in Europe and Homo sapiens in Africa. Populations of Homo heidelbergensis spread across Africa and into Europe somewhere between 700,000 and 500,000 years ago. Over time, geographic separation and different environmental pressures led the European and African populations down different evolutionary paths. The Europeans, adapting to the cold and the ice ages that repeatedly gripped the northern continent, would gradually become Neanderthals. The Africans, under different pressures and in a more varied environment, would gradually become us. The physical form of Homo heidelbergensis sits squarely between Homo erectus and the species it would produce. The brain had grown again, to around 1,200 cubic centimeters, approaching modern human size. The body was large and robust, built for power rather than the endurance-running frame of Homo erectus. The face still projected forward significantly, and the prominent brow ridge remained, but the overall skull shape was becoming more rounded, more modern. There was still no chin. What sets Homo heidelbergensis apart from everything that came before is not just its anatomy but its behavior. In 1995, at a site called Schöningen in northern Germany, researchers excavating a coal mine made a staggering find: 8 wooden spears, some nearly 2.5 meters long, preserved in waterlogged sediment that was 300,000 years old. These are the oldest complete hunting weapons ever discovered. They are not digging sticks or walking staffs. They are balanced, aerodynamic throwing spears, with the heaviest weight toward the front, the same design principle used in modern athletic javelins. Making them required selecting the right wood, working it over a long period, and understanding the physics of a thrown projectile well enough to shape it accordingly. This is not scavenging. This is hunting, active, planned, cooperative hunting of large animals. Horse bones found at the same site suggest that Homo heidelbergensis was capable of coordinating group hunts of prey far larger and faster than itself. That kind of hunting requires communication, planning, and a level of social coordination that goes significantly beyond anything we can confidently attribute to earlier species. There is also evidence of shelter. At sites in France and Terra Amata in Nice, researchers have found what appear to be the remains of constructed windbreaks and simple shelters, arrangements of posts and stones that suggest Homo heidelbergensis was not simply taking cover in whatever natural feature was available, but actively modifying the environment to create protected spaces. Whether this represents the beginning of something we might loosely call architecture is debated, but the impulse behind it, reshaping the world to better suit yourself rather than simply adapting to it, is deeply, recognizably human. Some researchers have proposed that Homo heidelbergensis may have had a form of rudimentary language, or at least a communication system significantly more sophisticated than anything that came before. The social complexity implied by cooperative hunting, shelter building, and the care for group members that we first see at Dmanisi would have been difficult to maintain without some form of enhanced communication. The anatomy of the vocal tract is difficult to reconstruct from fossils alone, but the hyoid bone, a small bone in the throat associated with speech, has been found in similar species from this period in forms that resemble the modern human version. We cannot hear what Homo heidelbergensis said to each other, if they said anything at all in any sense we would recognize. But we know that from their ranks two futures would emerge. One would become the dominant predator of Ice Age Europe, cold-adapted, powerful, and ultimately doomed. The other would walk out of Africa and change everything. From one ancestor, two futures would emerge. One would vanish. One would inherit the earth. There is perhaps no species in the entire history of life on Earth that has been more consistently misunderstood, more unfairly maligned, or more thoroughly rehabilitated by science in recent decades than the Neanderthals. For most of the time since their discovery in the mid-19th century, Neanderthals were portrayed as everything we feared we might once have been: brutish, stooped, dull-eyed, barely capable of making fire or stringing two thoughts together. The image was caricature, but it was a caricature that stuck, filtered into popular culture, into cartoons, into casual speech, where calling someone a Neanderthal became shorthand for calling them stupid or primitive. It was a slander written in ignorance, and the fossils have been correcting it slowly and persistently for the last 50 years. The Neanderthals were not primitive. They were extraordinary. They emerged in Europe and Western Asia somewhere around 400,000 years ago, descended from the Homo heidelbergensis populations that had been shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of Ice Age pressure. And the Ice Ages shaped them well. The Neanderthal body is a masterwork of cold climate adaptation. They were stocky and broad, shorter limbs reduce the surface area from which body heat can escape, and a barrel chest creates a larger lung volume for warming cold air before it reaches the body's core. The Neanderthal nose was large and wide, a biological air conditioner in reverse, warming and humidifying frigid air before it could damage delicate lung tissue. Their bones were thick and dense, their muscles powerfully built. A Neanderthal individual encountered on the street today would be immediately recognizable as different. The prominent brow ridge, the projecting face, the low, elongated skull, but they would also be immediately recognizable as something close. A cousin. A family member from a branch of the family that went its own way. Their brains were, on average, larger than ours. This is a fact that surprises many people and that deserves to be stated plainly. The average Neanderthal brain volume was between 1,400 and 1,500 cubic centimeters, slightly exceeding the modern human average of around 1,350. Brain size alone is not a reliable indicator of intelligence, and the internal organization and connectivity of the brain matters far more than raw volume. But the idea that Neanderthals were cognitively inferior to modern humans because of brain size is simply not supported by the anatomy. The tools they made, belonging to what archaeologists call the Mysterian industry, were sophisticated, carefully produced, and varied by region and purpose. Neanderthals were skilled knappers who could produce thin, precisely shaped flakes from prepared stone cores using a technique called levallois, a method that requires planning the shape of the core before any useful flake is struck, essentially building the template of the tool into the stone before the tool itself exists. They made scrapers, points, and hand axes adapted to the specific demands of their environment and their prey. And they buried their dead. At Shanidar Cave in the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, excavations in the 1950s and 1960s uncovered the remains of at least 10 Neanderthal individuals, several of them showing evidence of deliberate burial. One individual, known as Shanidar IV, was found surrounded by clumps of pollen, leading the original excavator Ralph Seletsky to propose that flowers had been placed on the body at burial. The flower burial interpretation has been challenged by subsequent researchers, who have suggested that the pollen may have been introduced by burrowing rodents or natural processes. The debate continues. But what is not debated is that Neanderthals at Shanidar were caring for their seriously injured in life. Shanidar I, an older male, had survived with a withered arm, a damaged eye socket, and severe arthritis, injuries that would have required years of support from others to live through. That is not the behavior of a brutish, unfeeling creature. The evidence for Neanderthal art and symbolic behavior has grown steadily and, in some cases, startlingly. At Cueva de los Avions, a cave in southeastern Spain, shell ornaments decorated with red and yellow pigments have been dated to approximately 115,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before modern humans arrived in Europe. If these dates are correct, and they have been produced using uranium-thorium dating methods considered highly reliable, then Neanderthals were engaging in personal ornamentation, the use of color and decoration to signal identity or status, long before any contact with Homo sapiens. Pigment has been found at multiple Neanderthal sites. Perforated shells, likely worn as jewelry, appear in the record. Eagle talons, too large and too numerous to be accidental, show up in Neanderthal contexts, possibly worn or used ceremonially. When modern humans arrived in Europe, beginning around 45,000 years ago, they encountered Neanderthals who had lived there for hundreds of thousands of years. What happened next is one of the great mysteries of prehistory. Within roughly 5,000 years of that contact, the Neanderthals were gone. What? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. Climate change played a role. The period between 45,000 and 40,000 years ago was one of significant environmental instability in Europe, with cold snaps and warm periods following each other in rapid succession. Competition with modern humans for the same prey animals may have slowly eroded the resources Neanderthal populations depended on. Disease, carried by the newcomers from Africa, could have devastated groups with no immunity. Some combination of all of these factors is likely. What the fossil and genetic evidence does not support is a story of deliberate, violent extermination, a genocide of the Neanderthals by invading modern humans. The picture is more complicated and, in some ways, more poignant than that, because they did not simply disappear. They merged. Modern genetic analysis, pioneered by Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute, work that earned Pääbo the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022, has revealed that modern humans whose ancestry lies outside of sub-Saharan Africa carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. The interbreeding happened multiple times in multiple places. Neanderthals and modern humans met, and some of what they were passed into us. Specific Neanderthal gene variants that exist in modern human populations have been linked to immune system function, skin and hair characteristics, and even responses to certain diseases. The Neanderthal contribution to the modern human genome is not vestigial or meaningless. It is functional. It is part of what we are. They were not our failures. They were our family. And a part of them lives in us still. In the year 2017, a team of researchers working at a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco made an announcement that quietly rewrote the opening chapter of our own story. The fossils they had found, skull fragments, jaw bones, teeth, limb bones, belonged to Homo sapiens, our species. And they were 300,000 years old. That number shattered a long-held assumption. For decades, the conventional wisdom had placed the origin of Homo sapiens in East Africa, the Great Rift Valley, the region that had given us Lucy and Homo habilis and so many other treasures, around 200,000 years ago. The Jebel Irhoud fossils pushed that date back by 100,000 years, and placed the earliest known members of our species not in East Africa but in the northwest corner of the continent, on the edge of what would eventually become the Sahara Desert. What this tells us is something important and humbling. Homo sapiens did not emerge in a single place at a single moment like a light switching on. We emerged across Africa, gradually in different populations in different regions, shaped by different environments and different pressures, occasionally separated by geography, occasionally reconnecting and mixing. The origin of our species was not a single event. It was a continent-wide process that unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years. The early Homo sapiens of 300,000 years ago looked almost like us, but not quite. The face was flatter than earlier hominins, the brow ridge reduced, the chin present, features we would recognize. But the back of the skull was still somewhat elongated rather than the rounded globe shape of fully modern humans. The brain was already large, around 1,350 cubic centimeters, but its internal organization was still shifting toward the configuration that would eventually produce language, art, and abstract thought. The hardware was nearly there. The software was still being written. For the next 200,000 years, Homo sapiens lived in Africa, hunting, gathering, surviving. They used tools. They likely used fire. They lived in groups. But for most of this period, there is little in the archaeological record to distinguish their behavior dramatically from that of Neanderthals or late Homo heidelbergensis populations living at the same time. They were anatomically modern. They were not yet, in any meaningful sense, behaviorally modern. And then something changed. Researchers call it the cognitive revolution. It happened approximately 70,000 years ago, though its roots may go back somewhat further, and its exact cause is one of the most debated questions in all of human science. What the archaeological record shows is a sudden, in geological terms, explosion of new behaviors. Burial of the dead with grave goods. Personal ornamentation with shells and pigments. Long-distance trade networks carrying materials hundreds of kilometers from their source. Musical instruments. And most significantly, art. At Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa, researchers have found pieces of ochre, a reddish iron-rich mineral, engraved with deliberate geometric patterns, dating to approximately 75,000 years ago. These are among the earliest known examples of humans making marks that carry meaning beyond function. They were not tools. They were not food. They were symbols, patterns made by a mind that could think in abstractions, that could create something purely to be seen and understood by another mind. In the caves of Europe, painted between 40,000 and 15,000 years ago, the evidence of that symbolic mind reaches its earliest artistic peak. At Lascaux in France and Altamira in Spain, ancient hands painted horses, bison, deer, and aurochs in ochre and charcoal with a skill and vividness that still stops modern visitors cold. At Chauvet Cave, the oldest of the great painted caves at around 36,000 years ago, lions and rhinoceroses and bears crowd the walls in confident, flowing lines. At Sulawesi in Indonesia, a pig painted on a cave wall has been dated to at least 45,500 years ago, currently the oldest known figurative artwork on Earth. These were not primitive scrawlings. They were art, made by people who looked at the world around them and felt compelled to recreate it, to capture it, to share it. People who had, in some fundamental way, crossed a threshold that no other species had ever reached. What crossed that threshold? What was the cognitive revolution really? The most compelling answer involves language, not just communication but true language. The ability to combine symbols in infinitely variable ways to express infinitely variable thoughts. Every species communicates. Birds warn each other of predators. Chimpanzees gesture and vocalize. But no other species can say, "Last Tuesday, 3 days after the river flooded, I saw a lion near the western waterhole, and if we leave before dawn tomorrow and circle north, we can avoid it." That sentence requires grammar, memory, temporal reasoning, and the ability to share a mental model of the world with another mind. Language did not just allow Homo sapiens to communicate better. It allowed them to cooperate on a scale no other species could match, and to cooperate with strangers, with people they had never met, around shared beliefs, shared stories, shared myths. The philosopher and historian Yuval Noah Harari has argued that what makes Homo sapiens truly unique is not our intelligence but our ability to believe in, and organize ourselves around, things that exist only in our collective imagination. A river is real. A border is not. Money is not. A nation is not. A god is not, at least not in the physical sense. And yet humans have organized armies, built cities, waged wars, created legal systems, and transformed entire landscapes in the name of things that exist only as shared stories. That capacity, to cooperate in massive numbers around shared fictions, is, in Harari's framework, the secret of our dominance. And it began, in some form, 70,000 years ago. Around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, small groups of Homo sapiens began to leave Africa. This was not a single coordinated migration. It was a slow generational drift, groups following coastlines, following prey, moving into territories that had never known a human footprint. They crossed into the Arabian Peninsula, moved along the coasts of South Asia, reached Southeast Asia and Australia, separated from the Asian mainland by open ocean, at least 50,000 years ago. They reached Europe around 45,000 years ago, where they encountered and interbred with the Neanderthals already living there. They crossed the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska somewhere between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, and within a few thousand years had spread from the Arctic tundra to the southern tip of South America. Wherever Homo sapiens went, the large animals died. In Australia, within a few thousand years of human arrival, most of the continent's megafauna, giant wombats the size of cars, 10-foot kangaroos, massive flightless birds, went extinct. The same pattern repeated in the Americas, in Madagascar and New Zealand. Whether this was caused entirely by human hunting or by a combination of hunting and climate change is debated. What is not debated is the pattern. Our arrival and their disappearance are linked repeatedly across every continent and island we reached. Around 12,000 years ago, in the river valleys of the Fertile Crescent, in what is now Iraq, Syria and Turkey, something happened that would prove as transformative as the cognitive revolution itself. Humans began farming. They began deliberately planting seeds, tending crops, domesticating animals. The agricultural revolution did not happen overnight, and it was not, at the individual level, obviously a good deal. Early farmers worked harder, ate a less varied diet, and were more vulnerable to famine and disease than the hunter-gatherers they replaced. But farming could support far more people per square kilometer than foraging, and so farming populations grew and spread and eventually covered the earth. And yet here we are, 300,000 years after the first anatomically modern humans walked the Moroccan plateau, 70,000 years after the cognitive revolution sparked something in the human mind that has never been extinguished, 12,000 years after the first seeds were deliberately planted in the first field, still telling stories, still making art, still asking the questions that, as far as we know, no other species has ever thought to ask. Where did we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Are we still evolving? The answer is yes. Evolution never stops. In populations that have herded cattle for thousands of years, the ability to digest lactose as an adult has spread widely, a recent and rapid adaptation. Populations long exposed to malaria carry genetic variants that provide partial protection. The human immune system continues to adapt to new pathogens. Our brains may be changing in ways too subtle and too slow for any individual lifetime to detect. We are not the end of the story. We are a chapter in it, the latest, the most complex, the most consequential, but not, in all likelihood, the last. We are the species that told stories. We are the species that looked at the night sky and named the stars. We are the species that buried our dead with flowers, painted animals on cave walls by firelight, sailed across unknown oceans toward horizons we could not see. And the greatest story we ever told was the story of ourselves, stretching back 7 million years, through every species in this long and winding chain, to a small creature in a shrinking forest who looked out at an open horizon and took a step. 7 million years. Say that number slowly and let it settle. 7 million years. It is a span of time so vast that the entire recorded history of human civilization, every empire, every war, every invention, every work of art, every dynasty that rose and crumbled, fits into the last 1/5000th of it. The pyramids of Egypt are newer, relative to Toomai, than this morning's news is to you. The birth of agriculture is a footnote at the very end of a story that began before the Sahara was a desert, before the Mediterranean had its current shape, before the mountains of East Africa had finished rising. And yet that entire 7 million year story led, without interruption, to this moment. To you, lying in the dark, listening. We have traveled far tonight. We began in a shrinking forest with a small creature whose skull carries only the faintest whisper of what it might become. Toomai, hope of life, standing at the edge of an open world it did not yet know how to enter. We followed the southern ape walkers as they committed, generation by generation, to the upright posture that would free their hands and eventually free their minds. We watched the first tool appear, a sharp flake of stone held in a hand that understood, however dimly, that the world could be reshaped to serve a purpose. We crossed continents with Homo erectus, the great traveler who carried fire into a cold world and cared for those who could no longer care for themselves. We stood with Homo heidelbergensis on the threshold between two futures, watching one lineage walk north into the ice and another remain in Africa, each becoming, slowly, something new. We sat in Neanderthal caves and found flowers on graves, pigment on shells, eagle talons worn as ornaments, and understood that the line between them and us is far thinner than we were ever taught to believe. And finally we arrived here, at our own story, at the cognitive revolution and the painted caves and the sailed oceans and the planted fields and the 7 billion people who cover this planet today. None of this was inevitable. At any point in those 7 million years the line could have ended. A drought lasting a few centuries longer. A volcanic winter that killed the last population of a critical ancestor. A single disease in a small isolated group. The margin between our existence and our non-existence, looked at honestly, is terrifyingly thin. We are not the inevitable outcome of evolution. We are one outcome, the one that happened to survive long enough to ask why it survived. Every species in this story was the right answer to the question its environment was asking. Tumai was the right answer for a forest-edge world in transition. Lucy was the right answer for an open savanna that rewarded upright walking. Homo habilis was the right answer for a landscape where the ability to extract nutrition from a carcass could make the difference between life and death. Homo erectus was the right answer for a warming world with open corridors leading out of Africa. Homo heidelbergensis was the right answer for a world that required better tools and better cooperation. The Neanderthals were the right answer for an Ice Age Europe that demanded physical toughness and cold climate adaptation. And Homo sapiens, we, became the right answer for a world that rewarded the ability to cooperate in large numbers around shared ideas. But here is what that means: none of them were failures. Not the Neanderthals, who survived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years and left their mark in our DNA. Not Homo erectus, who endured for nearly 2 million years, longer than any other human species, longer than we can currently imagine enduring. Not Australopithecus, who walked upright for 2 million years before the first tool was ever made. They were not failed attempts at becoming us. They were complete in themselves. They lived and struggled and cared for each other and died in a world that was entirely theirs. We are not the point they were building toward. We are simply what came next. And something will come after us too, whether that is a biological successor shaped by millions more years of evolution, or a transformation of our own species through technology and culture so profound that our descendants would barely recognize us, or simply the long continuation of what we already are, adapted to whatever world we are making. Evolution does not stop. It has never stopped. Not once in 4 billion years of life on this planet has the process paused, rested, declared itself finished. The chain is unbroken. From the first single-celled organism that appeared in the ancient ocean to Tumai at the forest edge to Lucy on the open savanna to the hands that painted the caves of Lascaux to the mind that is listening to these words right now, the chain is unbroken. Every link held. Every generation, however difficult the world it was born into, survived long enough to pass something forward. You are the result of an unbroken chain of survival stretching back to the very beginning of life on Earth. Not one of your ancestors, not one, in an unbroken line going back 7 million years just to the beginning of this story, and 4 billion years to the beginning of life itself, failed to survive long enough to reproduce. Every single one of them made it. Through ice ages and droughts, through predators and disease, through every catastrophe the planet could throw at a small and vulnerable living thing, every single one of them made it. And so did you. So close your eyes now. Let the story settle into the quiet places of your mind. Let 7 million years of survival, of curiosity, of care, of slow and patient becoming, let all of it rest gently around you like the darkness of a very old forest. You are not separate from this story. You are not observing it from the outside. You are the story. The latest chapter of the longest tale ever told, written not in words, but in bone and breath and the quiet, persistent beat of a heart that has been finding ways to keep beating for longer than the mind can truly hold. Sleep well. You have earned it. Every ancestor you have ever had made sure of that. This has been Sleep While Learning. Thank you for journeying through 7 million years of human evolution. We will see you in the next story.